The morning broke with a brittle chill, the kind that clung to skin and bone, seeping into every corner of the small rural town. Dust drifted lazily through beams of pale sunlight, stirred by the shuffling hooves of horses penned tightly behind wooden rails. The auction yard, with its cracked earth and rough planks, smelled of hay, sweat, and the sharp tang of nervous animals. Voices rose in a chorus of chatter, bargaining, and laughter, but the noise seemed to wash past one corner of the yard where a frail colt stood alone. His body, all angles and shadows, looked unsteady on spindly legs that trembled with each breath. His ribs pressed sharply beneath his dull, patchy coat, and his ears twitched at every sound, but he did not lift his head. He had once known warmth, his mother's milk, her nuzzle against his mane, but that had ended too soon. She had been sold before he was old enough to understand, and what remained was a hollow ache that no bucket of grain could soothe. Owners had neglected him, feeding him scraps, leaving him to grow weak while other colts grew strong and proud. Now, thrust into this noisy place, his hollow eyes betrayed not only fear but the strange resignation of one who had learned too early that kindness was rare. The auctioneer's booming voice cut across the air, a practiced chant that rose and fell like the rhythm of a drum. Buyers leaned forward eagerly when a glossy bay stallion was paraded into the ring, his coat gleaming in the light. Numbers climbed fast, voices shouted, hands lifted with determination. A clap of approval followed as the stallion was sold, led away to admiring glances. Another horse followed, and another, each strong, healthy, full of promise. The crowd's energy swelled with every bid, a mix of excitement and triumph. Then, a hush prickled through the air as the weak colt was tugged toward the center. The handler gave him a rough jerk, impatient when the colt stumbled and nearly fell. His hooves scraped against the dirt, his head hung low, and the murmurs began. Laughter, quiet at first, then louder, rippled through the onlookers. "That one won't last a week," a man scoffed, spitting into the dust. "Waste of feed," another replied with a sneer. "Should have been left where he was." The auctioneer tried to maintain his rhythm, his chant filling the silence, but it faltered when no one responded. His voice rose louder, almost desperate, each pause stretching longer than the last. "Who'll start me at 50? 30? 20? His eyes searched the crowd, but all he saw were crossed arms and shaking heads. From near the back, a girl stood with her father. She was young, her braided hair trailing down her shoulder, her boots scuffed with years of ranch work. Her gaze did not flinch from the colt. Where others saw weakness, she saw something different, something lodged deep in his dark, glassy eyes. They were not lifeless, not completely. Beneath the fear was a flicker, fragile but unbroken, as though he still waited for someone to notice him. She tugged at her father's sleeve. "Look at him," she whispered, her voice trembling with urgency. The man's brow furrowed as he followed her gaze. His jaw tightened. "He's too far gone. No muscle, no spirit. That colt will break your heart." "But look at his eyes," she pressed. "He's still trying. I can see it." The father said nothing at first, watching as the colt shifted uncomfortably under the auctioneer's strained chant. The man's hands were calloused, his face weathered from years of ranching, and he had seen enough to know when an animal was unlikely to survive. Yet the quiet determination in his daughter's voice unsettled him, made him hesitate. "Don't get attached," he muttered finally. "We can't save them all." "I don't want to save them all," she answered softly. "Just him." Around them, the crowd grew restless. The auctioneer's forehead glistened with sweat as he called out one last plea. $10. Anyone at 10? This little colt just needs a home. Anyone? The silence that followed pressed heavy, suffocating. People shifted their weight, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to take responsibility. The colt's legs wavered, and he lowered his head further, as though bracing himself against the inevitable. For a heartbeat, it seemed certain that no hand would rise, that he would be dismissed as nothing more than a mistake. The air itself seemed to pause, waiting for the hammer to fall. The girl's hand trembled as she reached for her father's arm again, her voice urgent but hushed. "Please, don't let them give up on him. Not like this." The man exhaled slowly, his shoulders heavy under the weight of the moment. He looked again at the colt, at the trembling legs, the hollow frame, the faint glimmer of defiance in those dark eyes. He thought of the times he had been underestimated, dismissed, written off. He thought of how it had felt to prove them wrong. The auctioneer's voice cracked. "Last call. $10, anyone? This is the final chance." A deep silence followed, stretching so long it seemed endless. The colt shifted once more, his frail body casting a small shadow against the bright dust. His ears flicked toward the crowd, searching, hoping, almost pleading. And then a single voice rang out, clear and firm, slicing through the stillness. "I'll take him." Gasps fluttered across the gathered crowd, disbelief mingling with murmurs of surprise. The auctioneer blinked, stunned into silence, before relief surged across his face. "Sold!" he shouted, striking the gavel with finality. The girl's heart leapt, her fingers clutching at her father's sleeve in wordless gratitude. The colt lifted his head just slightly, as if he had heard, as if the sound of salvation had reached him at last. His eyes glimmered, faint but real, with the spark of something that had nearly been lost. And though the dust still swirled, though the laughter and judgment still lingered on the edges of the crowd, the story of the weak colt had only just begun. The ride home was long, the trailer rocking gently with every turn of the wheels. The colt stood unsteadily inside, his legs splaying whenever the road curved. He had never known such a confined space, and the sound of rattling metal unsettled him. Yet there was something different in the air. No jeering voices, no impatient tug of a rope, only the hum of the truck ahead, and the occasional glance of the girl through the small window. Her eyes carried no judgment, only a quiet promise. He did not understand it fully, but the faint tension in his body loosened each time her gaze lingered. When they reached the ranch, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of rose and amber. The father opened the trailer with a measured sigh, half expecting the colt to collapse before his hooves even touched the ground. But the animal stepped down slowly, wobbling but determined. He paused on the dirt, ears twitching, eyes wide at the expanse before him. The ranch stretched vast and quiet, with worn fences, fields brushed with golden light, and the faint lowing of cattle in the distance. For the first time in his short life, he was not surrounded by cruelty or indifference. The girl approached with deliberate gentleness, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. In her hand she carried a small bucket of fresh water. The colt flinched at first, his instincts braced for harshness, but her voice, low and steady, wove through the air like a lullaby. "Easy now," she whispered, holding the bucket just close enough for him to see. His nostrils flared, uncertain, until thirst overcame fear. He dipped his muzzle into the cool liquid, drinking deeply, each swallow reviving a spark inside him. The girl smiled faintly, as though the sight itself was a victory. That night, he lay on a bed of clean straw in a stall that smelled of hay and cedar shavings. The father leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his expression still lined with doubt. "He's weak," he murmured to himself. "It'll take more than kindness to save him." Yet even as he spoke, he watched the colt curl into the straw, watched the girl sit just outside the stall, humming softly as if to anchor him in this new place. Something in her persistence unsettled his certainty, though he did not say so aloud. The days that followed were marked by small, quiet battles. The colt resisted at first, shying from the halter, shrinking from the brush. Years of neglect had carved suspicion into his bones. But the girl's patience never wavered. She rose with the dawn, her hands raw from chores, yet she always saved a part of herself for him. She fed him handfuls of oats, coaxed him closer with slices of apple, and spoke to him as though he could understand every word. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his trembling eased. He allowed the brush to stroke across his back, allowed her hand to rest on his neck. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he lowered his head against her shoulder. The weight of it was fragile but deliberate, and she froze, hardly daring to breathe. It was the first sign of trust, and she felt it like a flame blooming inside her chest. The father noticed the change, though he did not say much. He saw the colt's steps grow steadier, his coat less dull under the girl's care. But he also saw the shadows of weakness that lingered. The other horses, strong and sure, galloped across the pasture with ease, while the colt lagged behind, stumbling, his legs unable to match their rhythm. The contrast was painful to watch. The father worried that his daughter's heart was tying itself to something fragile, something that might shatter at the first hard test. One afternoon, when the colt attempted a run, he surprised them both. He started slow, his body swaying, hooves uneven, but midway across the field, something inside him ignited. His stride lengthened, his head lifted, and for a brief, fleeting moment, he moved with the grace of the horses he had once envied. Dust rose behind him, the sunlight catching in his mane. The girl gasped, clapping her hands together with delight. "Did you see that?" she cried, her voice ringing with joy. The father had seen, his brow furrowed, his mouth set, but there was a flicker in his eyes, a reluctant recognition that perhaps this colt held more than weakness inside him. Still, he shook his head, unwilling to give his daughter false hope. "One good run doesn't change what he is," he muttered. Yet the words lacked conviction. That night, as the girl leaned against the stall, the colt rested nearby, his breathing steady. She whispered into the quiet, her fingers curling gently through the straw. "You're not weak. You just need time. I'll believe for both of us until you can believe it yourself." The colt lifted his head, ears pricked, as though he understood. For the first time, he did not look away when her eyes met his. The days bled into weeks, and though his progress was uneven, it was undeniable. His coat grew glossier, his ribs less sharp. He learned to follow her call, to accept her touch, without flinching. He stumbled often, but he rose every time, and each fall seemed to teach him something new about balance, about resilience. The bond between them deepened, an unspoken thread binding them together. Where once there had been silence, there was now quiet companionship. But shadows lingered in the father's mind. He knew the world was not kind to weakness, that sentiment could not shield an animal from the harsh demands of survival. He worried for his daughter, feared the inevitable heartbreak that might come. And yet, despite his caution, he began to linger more often at the fence, watching the colt's slow transformation. The laughter of the crowd at the auction haunted him still, but the memory of his daughter's unwavering voice, just him, lingered louder. One evening, as the sky burned gold and the air grew still, the colt stood taller than before, his head lifted with quiet pride. The girl leaned against the fence, her smile wide, her eyes shining with a faith that had never faltered. The father stood beside her, silent, his gaze locked on the animal that had once been nothing more than a source of pity. For the first time, he did not think of weakness. He thought of possibility, and though he did not say it aloud, he knew the story of this colt was far from finished. The trials ahead would be harder, the tests harsher. Yet something within him, reluctant but real, began to wonder if perhaps the little colt might prove them all wrong. The wind carried the smell of fresh earth, and would smoke as the town bustled with an energy that came only once a year. Posters tacked onto fence posts and storefronts announced the upcoming fair, their inked letters boasting contests of skill, speed, and strength. For most families, the event was a celebration, a chance to gather and measure pride against neighbors. For the girl, however, it became something more. As she leaned against the pasture fence, watching the colt's uneven strides grow steadier each day, she felt the stirrings of an idea that refused to be silenced. Perhaps the fair could be the place where he proved, not just to her family, but to everyone who had mocked him, that weakness did not define him. She mentioned it one evening at supper, her voice low but firm. "There's a small trial for young horses at the fair," she said, pushing her food around the plate. "I think he could do it." Her father looked up sharply, his fork pausing midair. The silence between them stretched heavy until he finally spoke. "That colt isn't ready. You've seen him. He still stumbles on flat ground. Putting him in front of a crowd will only shame you both." Her jaw tightened, but her voice did not waver. "He's stronger now. And it's not about winning. It's about giving him a chance." The father leaned back, studying her. His eyes held both weariness and a flicker of concern. "Do you know what they'll say if he fails? They'll laugh. The same way they did at the auction. Are you ready for that?" Her heart thudded painfully. The memory of the cruel laughter still fresh, but she lifted her chin. "I don't care what they say. I care what he becomes." For a long moment, her father said nothing. Then he sighed, a long exhale that carried both resignation and an unspoken pride in his daughter's resolve. "If you're set on this, then we'll do it right. But understand, it'll be hard. Harder than you think." From that day forward, their lives bent toward preparation. The mornings began earlier, the air still damp with dew as the girl led the colt into the field. His legs wavered at first under the strain of new exercises. She coaxed him into short runs, encouraging every step, clapping softly when he steadied his pace. Sometimes he stumbled so badly he scraped his knees, and she knelt beside him, brushing dirt from his coat, whispering words of reassurance until he rose again. The father watched from a distance at first, arms crossed, but eventually he stepped in, offering guidance. His voice, gruff and measured, called out instructions. "Shorter distances. Don't push him too far too fast. Let him build strength first." Though reluctant, he found himself drawn into the effort, his skepticism tempered by the colt's persistence. Each time the animal rose after a fall, he saw something undeniable, an ember of determination that no weakness had extinguished. Days blurred into weeks. The colt's body began to change. His ribs still showed faintly, but muscle grew beneath his skin. His stride lengthened, less erratic, more confident. The girl's laughter rang across the field whenever he managed a clean, strong run, her joy a sound that seemed to feed his spirit as much as grain fed his body. There were setbacks, too, days when exhaustion made him falter, nights when the girl wept quietly into her pillow, afraid she was asking too much of him. But each morning she rose again, her resolve as steady as the rising sun. The night before the fair, the ranch lay quiet under a sky stitched with stars. The girl slipped into the barn, lantern in hand, and sat outside the colt's stall. He lifted his head as she approached, his eyes calm but alert. She leaned against the wooden boards, speaking softly into the hush. "Tomorrow will be loud. People will stare. Some might laugh. But none of that matters. All that matters is that you try. I'll be right there. You won't face them alone." The colt shifted closer, pressing his muzzle gently against the bars. For a moment, girl and animal breathed in rhythm, the silence between them filled with understanding too deep for words. She reached through the gap, resting her hand against his cheek, and in that touch was a vow. Whatever happened, they would face it together. Dawn broke with a restless energy. The fairgrounds bustled, carriages rattling, vendors shouting, children weaving between booths with sticky hands. Horses gleamed under the sun, brushed until their coats shone, their manes braided with ribbons. Proud owners boasted to one another, their voices swelling with confidence. When the girl arrived with the colt, heads turned immediately. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some pitying, others mocking. "Isn't that the one from the auction? He won't even make it to the gate. Poor thing. What's she thinking, bringing him here?" The father heard every word, his jaw tight, but he held his tongue. He watched his daughter walk beside the colt, her hand resting lightly on the rope, her posture unshaken. Though laughter followed them, she did not falter. When the moment came, they stood at the edge of a small arena. Dust swirled beneath the morning sun, the scent of hay and anticipation hanging in the air. The announcer called their names, and the crowd leaned forward, eager for entertainment. The girl stroked the colt's neck, whispering once more, "You can do this." The gate opened. The colt stepped forward, legs uncertain. He stumbled almost immediately, his hoof catching on loose earth. Gasps and laughter rose from the stands. Someone shouted, "Told you so." The girl's face flushed, but she did not look at the crowd. Instead, she tightened her grip on the rope and steadied her voice. "Easy. You're all right. One step at a time." The colt flicked his ears, trembling but still moving, his head lowered as though fighting the weight of doubt pressing down from all directions. Each stride was a battle, his legs threatening to betray him again. The laughter grew louder, the jeers sharper. For a moment, it seemed he would collapse under the burden of it all, his story ending here, just as so many had predicted. The girl refused to let go. Her voice cut through the noise, low but fierce. I believe in you. Show them. The colt lifted his head just slightly, his ears pricking at her words. His step steadied, his body gathering itself. Dust clung to his legs, sunlight glinted in his dark eyes. The crowd's laughter faltered, uncertainty creeping in. Something shifted, subtle yet undeniable. The trial had only begun, but the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether the frail colt would rise or fall. The arena seemed to shrink around them, every eye fixed on the colt whose first steps had nearly ended in disaster. Dust clung to his trembling legs, the echo of laughter still hanging in the air. The girl's hand pressed steady against his neck, her voice low and insistent. You're stronger than they think. Show them what I see. For a moment, the colt only stood there, chest heaving, fear thick in his eyes. But then, as if a spark had been struck inside him, he lifted his head higher than before. His ears twitched forward, and his legs steadied beneath him. The jeers from the crowd faltered into an uneasy hush. The first obstacle loomed ahead, a simple rail no higher than the colt's knees. The crowd leaned forward, waiting for failure. The colt hesitated, hooves pawing at the ground, until the girl whispered, "Go on." With a sudden burst, he leapt clumsily, but cleared the rail. Gasps cut through the silence, some incredulous, some grudgingly impressed. He landed unevenly, stumbling a step, yet he did not fall. The girl's face lit with pride, her encouragement spilling out in a stream of soft words. One by one, the challenges came. Cones to weave through, a narrow bridge to cross, rails slightly higher than the first. Each time he faltered, the crowd seemed ready to resume its mockery. Yet each time, he pushed forward, as though drawing strength not from his body, but from the unyielding belief of the girl beside him. His muscles strained, his sides darkened with sweat, but determination blazed in his eyes. The father, watching from the rail, felt his throat tighten. He had prepared himself for humiliation, had braced for the pain of seeing his daughter's hope crushed. But now, as he watched the colt stumble and recover again, he realized he was witnessing something rarer than perfection, resilience. Midway through the course, the most daunting obstacle waited, a set of rails stacked higher than any he had faced. The crowd buzzed with anticipation, eager for the spectacle of failure. The colt slowed, his head lowering, doubt etched in every line of his body. The girl's hand shook as she tightened her grip on the rope. She knelt slightly, bringing her face near his, whispering fiercely, "I'm here. You've come this far. Don't stop now." The colt snorted, ears flicking back, then forward again. With a sudden surge, he gathered himself and leapt. His legs brushed the top rail, and for a breathless instant it seemed he might fall. But he landed hard, staggered, and found his footing. The arena erupted, not with laughter this time, but with cheers and applause, raw and startled, as though the crowd itself had been caught off guard by its own admiration. The girl clung to his mane, tears streaking her cheeks, while the colt's eyes gleamed with a fire that no one had seen before. From that moment, the course seemed to bend in his favor. Every stride grew surer, every leap stronger. Dust rose in golden plumes around him, sunlight catching in his mane as though crowning him with light. The girl ran beside him, her laughter breaking free now, ringing clear and bright. For the first time, the colt moved not as a creature of pity, but as one of purpose. The final stretch lay ahead, a straight path lined with watching faces. He surged forward, hooves pounding against the earth in a rhythm that silenced even the doubters. When he crossed the finish, the noise of the crowd swelled like a tide, thunderous and undeniable. The father pressed a hand to his face, swallowing hard. He had doubted, had guarded his heart against disappointment. But as he watched the colt stand tall in the center of the arena, his daughter's arms thrown around his neck, he felt a weight lift from his chest. "You proved me wrong," he murmured, almost to himself, though pride softened the rough edges of his voice. The announcer declared the run complete, his voice almost reverent. People pressed against the rails, eager to touch the colt, to speak words of praise. Yet the girl shielded him gently, guiding him back toward the quiet of the gate. To her, the cheers mattered little. The true victory had been won the moment he lifted his head against the tide of doubt and chose to keep moving forward. In the days that followed, word of the frail colt's triumph spread beyond the fairgrounds. Neighbors who had once mocked approached the ranch with new respect, offering kind words and astonished praise. Yet for the girl, the memory that lingered was not the roar of the crowd, but the feeling of his head resting against her shoulder in the quiet before the trial. That, she knew, was where his courage had begun. The colt's transformation did not end with the fair. Each morning he stood straighter, his body filling with strength where once there had been weakness. The father, once skeptical, found himself working alongside his daughter, teaching her how to train him further. He did not admit it easily, but he had grown attached, his heart tugged by the very animal he had once dismissed as hopeless. Together, the three of them built a rhythm: early mornings, steady work, quiet evenings when the colt rested with his head nestled against the girl's chest. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of crimson, the father spoke aloud what had long settled in his heart. "I was wrong about him," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And I was wrong to doubt you. You saw something none of us did." The girl smiled, her hand running along the colt's neck. "I didn't see what he was. I saw what he could be." The father nodded slowly, pride and humility mingling in his expression. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe fully, not just in the colt, but in the power of his daughter's unwavering faith. The colt lifted his head, eyes dark and steady, as though aware of the moment's weight. He was no longer the weak animal left alone at the auction, mocked and unwanted. He was proof that belief, even when carried by just one heart, could change the course of a life. The story did not end in that moment. It carried forward, in every stride he took, in every lesson the girl learned at his side, in every quiet glance from the father who had learned that strength often hides beneath the surface, waiting only for someone to draw it out. The world would always have its doubters, its laughter, its harsh judgments. But the colt had already faced them and had risen above. And as the ranch settled into twilight, the girl whispered the words that had carried them both this far, words that now felt less like hope and more like truth. "You were never weak. You just needed someone to believe." The colt breathed out softly, leaning into her touch, the sound as gentle as a promise. Somewhere in the silence of the fields, the echoes of the auction faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of hooves against earth, strong and sure. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing. I bring true, heartfelt stories every day.